we're so proud of all of you join with us today. I also want to give a special thanks to the Office of Refugee Resettlement, whose support has made this webinar possible. Some of you may remember that back at the beginning of the year, Welcoming America sent out a survey to the Refugee Resettlement Network asking for areas of technical assistance that people were most interested in learning more about. And dialogue was one of those key priority areas that people wanted to explore further. So we're really excited to be able to share more with you about dialogue today and to hear from some key experts who have many years of experience using dialogue to help bridge differences out in our communities. Today's outcomes are in front of you. Really, we'll be spending a little time just getting a better understanding of what dialogue is and how it might be useful in your everyday work. You also have the chance to access new tools on how to plan and organize community dialogues. And then perhaps most importantly, we hope you'll pick up some tips along the way on how you can host and facilitate effective dialogue. And to cover all that and get to those outcomes, we're really pleased to have some great speakers join us, and you'll see today's agenda. I'm going to go ahead and give you a little background on each of them now, just so we can have the best flow possible for our webinar today. And then as the last speaker wraps up, we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. So again, as you're listening to the speakers, if you have questions, if you have comments, do feel free to type them in at the Q&A box, and I will be happy to read through those and moderate what we hope will be a very interactive conversation on dialogue. So to kick us off this afternoon, we'll first be hearing from Jessie Molina from Welcoming America, one of my coworkers. And Jessie serves as the Director of Training and Education and has piloted Welcoming America's Dialogue Initiative. Jessie's facilitated over 10 dialogues in the area focused on immigration, and she's trained Welcoming America's affiliates in dialogue techniques in places like New Orleans, Oakley, California, Salt Lake City, and Tuscaloosa, Alabama. So Jessie will start giving us a little bit of background dialogue, what it is and how it can best be used. After Jessie, we're pleased to have Mavish Hassan join us. She's an independent consultant in the San Francisco Bay Area, and as a consultant with the Institute for Local Government, her projects have focused on the launch of 2 welcoming initiatives in California and the facilitation of the Welcoming California Learning Network. Her dialogue design and facilitation experience includes work with Public Conversations Project, consulting for Active Voice, Boston citywide dialogues on race and ethnicity, and planning, organizing, and facilitating South Asian community dialogues. And then Mavish will spend a little time talking about the planning and the preparation for dialogue, really getting to the heart of how to plan and implement these kinds of techniques. And finally, we'll hear from Maggie Herzig on the other side of the country, based in Boston. Maggie is a founding associate of the Public Conversations Project, and she has 23 years of experience in designing and facilitating conversations across divides related to identity and worldview. And with colleague Bob Staines, Maggie regularly offers a 2-day training on facilitation skills called Facilitating with Purpose and Poise. And she's going to be sharing more with us on how to design dialogue sessions and how to facilitate them. So after our 3 speakers, again, we'll have plenty of time for your questions and for them to give you some answers, and also really for your comments. So if you have experience in your own communities or your own organizations around dialogue, we'd love to hear from you too. And then we'll wrap wrap up the end of our time today just with some easy ways you can stay engaged on this issue for those of you who are interested in continuing to explore the use of dialogue. So with that gives you an overview of how we'd like to spend our time with you today. I'm pleased to turn it over to Jessie Molina at Welcoming America, and she will get us started with a little bit of background on dialogue. Jessie?
Thanks, Lynn. Good everyone. I'm happy to be here. So we're just going to start off with a definition. What is dialogue? And a definition that we have been using is dialogue is a conversation in which people who have different views on a topic explore their perspectives in an effort to build mutual understanding and connection. And so the real purpose there for us is mutual understanding and connection. Some features that it allows participants to share their personal experiences, their values and concerns, allows people to appreciate new ideas and viewpoints, and to meaningful differences of opinions. So oftentimes in our normal everyday life, we don't have the opportunity to talk with people who think differently than us. And the way that we structure dialogues is to really allow people who think differently, who have differing opinions, engage with those differences. It's also structured to build empathy between people, connection, and community, particularly if they're done over time in a sustained way. I'd like time to talk about dialogue as distinguished from debate. Dialogue is collaborative in nature. Two or more sides are working together toward a common understanding. And that's not to say that we're trying to move people to some kind of common agreement or a particular understanding of the issue, but really allowing people to take the time to understand each other's viewpoints if they end up disagreeing still at the end. Distrust is more oppositional. Sides tend to oppose each other and try to prove that their side is right and the other side is wrong. Emphasize listening to understand. And so we really encourage our participants that when they get that emotional charge of hearing something that is offensive to them or something that they strongly disagree with, to kind of rein back that first impulse to respond away and to act, but actually to ask a question and really try and understand the other side's perspective, where they emphasize more listening to flaws and to find those counter-arguments. To allow people and give people the opportunity to reveal what assumptions they may be holding and to look at those assumptions and reevaluate them. So one of the questions we use, which comes from the Public Conversations Project model, is what in your experience has led you to think the way you think about immigration? And in that first question, participants say, this on the news, or I read this in the paper, or on the news, I read this. And so the first allows them to look at their assumptions about whether they have their own opinion about this issue or whether that opinion has come from someone else, and to really evaluate that. Whereas they tend to ask you to, stay with what you believe and defend that to the end. It does emphasize and encourage introspection onto your own opinion, as opposed to critiquing others' opinions. So we really encourage people to look at what they're thinking and to explore it and to listen to what other people are saying and to others' experiences. Use that opportunity to, in listening to others, to really refine what they believe and come to understand what it is that they truly believe. I want to share with you some of our participant experiences in dialogues in Atlanta on immigration. These all came from the evaluations that we give participants at the end of our conversation. Came from a participant who said, "I'm into the conversation with the preconceived notion that immigrants are lazy and don't pay taxes. My mind was completely changed with my own opinions. I thought this discussion was amazing. I'm listening to my classmates who had opinions and experiences with immigrants. They find what I believe." And I comment to be really helpful and powerful because she believed that her mind was changed with her own opinions. And so through facts or understanding the immigration system better, that what was changed her opinion, felt that it was through listening to experiences and synthesizing those that her mind was changed with her own opinions. It helped her mind do what she believed. And that's where we're all joined together. Even though immigration doesn't affect me in the same way as others, it affects me because I'm human. In the conversation, in the opening question, many of the participants said, "Well, I don't really know too much about this issue. It doesn't really affect me. I haven't been paying attention to it." And so we achieved our goal of helping people feel more connected to one another, because this person feels that even though it may not affect her in the same way as it affects immigrants, it's still an issue that affects her, and she feels that sense of connection. To see every day and to put their name and face to the issue, it's everything for me. It just humbles me. And again, one of our goals for dialogues, immigration is a complex issue. It's an issue that's hard to understand. It's an issue that has many, many different facets, including very complex legal facets. And it's been a powerful time, and again, for our participants to really put a name and a face to the issue by listening to the personal stories of people that come to dialogue. I with the people in class, and I will always stand up for them. So any goals of changing people's minds or encouraging some kind of policy outcome, or really to encourage people to do anything after a dialogue, it was helpful that how they end up feeling is so connected to people who are different than them, that they feel that they will stand up for immigrants and for the people that were in the dialogue.
So to plan and organize a dialogue, it's really important to be clear about the purpose. Dialogue can be a really powerful way to build mutual understanding and connection, but its purpose is not to change minds, but as the quotations that Jesse shared earlier, and as those quotations reflect, people's perspectives might be broadened, there might be a shift, there might be new learning, but that's not the purpose that you go into planning a dialogue with. Obviously, if people are really up for a battle, or if they really want to get into an argument or a debate, it's really important to be clear that this is not the space, the dialogue space is not the space for them to use. It's also really important to be clear that the purpose of dialogues is not to advocate for a specific policy. We appreciate that both advocacy and dialogue two very different, valuable tools, valuable components of democracy. But dialogue, again, is not a space to advocate for a specific policy. How strongly each one of us might believe in a specific policy or be working towards that. If we have clarity of purpose and we're clear on what the purpose of a dialogue in your community would be, one can start exploring what this dialogue might look like, and think about the ideal process to match the purpose that you've identified. So to really match a process to meet the purpose that you've identified early on, as well as meet the expected participants where they are. And we'll talk about that a little bit later and actually throughout the webinar a little bit about really ensuring that we're mindful of the expectations of the participants as well as our purpose as we design dialogues. Is consider process options. You might think that a structured conversation or a community dialogue where people are sitting around in a circle or in a specific space best meets your purpose or meets the participants that you hope to invite to the dialogue. Might even explore other formats. So you might think about perhaps showing a film followed with a dialogue and discussion, or perhaps a panel of speakers, or even just a simple potluck with just small dialogues at the table, something fairly simple. Might consider a nation of one of the above. So it doesn't have to be one specific structure. You really have to think about what's a process that your expected participants would be most interested in, most comfortable with, what might be most culturally appropriate for the folks that you're hoping to engage in the dialogue. And so one of you best knows who your likely audience is for the dialogues that you're hoping to organize in your community. Generally, it's likely to be members of both the receiving community as well as refugees. As we say that, we want to, ensure that there's different segments of the receiving community. You might, in fact, have longer-term immigrants who've been in a community a long time who perhaps are part of the receiving community. That's certainly something that we see a lot in communities across California, where there's no monolith receiving community and certainly no monolith refugee community, even if refugees we're working with might be coming from one specific area. There's certainly segments within each of those. But regardless of who that audience is, there's certain goals for your recruitment or your outreach process through the dialogue. You want to really strive for diversity so that you're ensuring that you are touching various segments of each of the receiving as well as refugee communities. And to ensure that diversity, you really do want to be strategic with invitations, over invitation process, who you're inviting, who's doing the inviting, etc. And again, as we might repeat again and again, understanding the context of the group or the community, the receiving as well as the refugee community that you are hoping to engage in the dialogue. So give the audience that you identified, how might you plan to support the purposes identified? You want to support the purposes by modeling collaboration, building earning trust, and prepare yourselves as well as the facilitators. Model collaboration by ensuring that the planning team is reflective of who your expected participants are. So that by ensuring that the collaborative planning process that includes trusted, credible refugee as well as receiving community members, as well as modeling collaboration both to the event, during, and following the actual dialogue event. You can help build and earn the trust by, as each of you best know, considering really safe and accessible venues, so community centers or schools or congregational spaces, whatever feels safe for your hoped-for audience, for your hoped-for participants, as well as access in terms of public transportation or any other access issues that you want to make sure that you're mindful of. Also help really build and earn trust by trying to see if you do co-facilitated teams. So you develop a team of facilitators that reflects both the refugee as well as receiving community members. Reduce anxiety. That's another. It's a really important component of preparing yourselves in organizing as well as facilitating dialogues. By ensuring that you take this time to emotionally prepare prepare yourselves, so you know what to expect and that you're equipped with tools to address the unexpected. So the emotional readiness of the facilitators and the organizers is a really critical piece in planning to support the purposes that you've identified. Cannot stress enough the role of the pre-work. So in addition to preparing yourselves as organizers or facilitators, there are ways that you can help prepare the participants as well. So in thinking about the invitations, you want to make sure that the invitation connects the dialogue to what matters to the participants. So, and this, as we mentioned earlier, understanding the context will help you design a dialogue that meets sort of issues and concerns and meets the participants where they are. You want to pay special attention to who should issue the invite, who is a credible, trusted person in the community, both for the refugees as well as the receiving community members. And as part of that invitation, be really, really clear that it's not a space for a debate, it's not a space to have an argument, but really to build some mutual understanding and connection, and through good listening. And we'll talk about again a little bit later. In planning, checking in with the participants, dialogue will really help you design a structure that meets their hopes and expectations or cultural norms. It's also a way for you to be better informed about possible fears or hot button issues that you should be mindful of as you start conversation amongst the participants. You might, in some cases, consider doing an intra-group dialogue. So a dialogue with just refugees, a dialogue with just the receiving community members, before you bring them together to participate in an intergroup dialogue. That might be something that you want to think about. And this check-in doesn't have to be, it could be also by attending a meeting that's already happening, that's already on calendar, and it can be an opportunity for you to share your hopes, the process, the purpose, etc., so people have a sense of what they might expect before the dialogue. And as you're going through the planning process, be prepared for the dialogues to bring up emotions, and consider the emotional readiness both for yourself, as we've said, for the facilitators, as well as the expected participants. So before we move into planning a dialogue session, here are key goals that you want to make sure has filled with the most appropriate person in your community. So again, the host convener, ensuring that it's someone or someone's folks who are credible, who are trusted by both the refugee as well as receiving community members, and ensuring that the facilitator team represents either participants, the participants, or if you need to see it as a facilitator who's considered an objective, professional facilitator, if you're not able to identify someone from the receiving and refugee communities who might be prepared enough or able to facilitate the dialogue. And planning team, we talked collaborative planning process. It's really also important to ensure that it balances the multiple segments that are a refugee community and of the receiving communities that you're working in, and making sure that there's a balance not only on the planning team but obviously in terms of who the expected participants are from various segments of the refugee and receiving communities.
So this is Maggie, and I'm going to start by talking about what a session might look like, particularly if it's a single session, like just an evening session. I'm going to speak as if the listeners to the webinar would anticipate playing the role of a facilitator, but as Mavish said, in some cases, you might, well, I'd like to be a part of the planning process, but there might be somebody else in the community who would play the facilitation role. Thinking about the opening segment of the meeting, as I said, you want to think about the best match for each of these roles, and welcoming part of a session could be handled well by, say, the host of the building that it's in, if they've been helpful in the planning. Could be a community leader that hasn't been deeply involved in the planning but understands what's going on. It could be the facilitator, but you want to think of how the welcome can be a good launching point into the dialogue. And then you want to orient people to what dialogue session is and what it isn't. Either stating the purpose, or if you've done the kind of work that Mavish talked about, you're really just reinforcing and repeating what hopefully people would have learned before they come about the purpose of the meeting, about its goal to foster understanding and not to have a debate. You might at this point also share a little background about how the meeting came to be. If people are a little distrustful, they can easily think that there's agendas out there, or where it come from. So transparency is generally a good thing. It contributes to trust building. Then you can ask the group to make some communication agreements with each other, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. Now, I put introductions after agreements. The introductions come before the agreements, but I would only suggest that if the introductions are very brief and simple, like your name and where you live or something like that, because it's really helpful to have agreements in place before you open things up so that people can speak at more length. Now, at the Public Conversations Project, we use a fair amount of structure in the early part of a dialogue. So we start with very structured questions. We usually have like maybe 2 or 3 go-rounds during which everybody responds to a question that we pose. And I will speak a little bit more about questions in a moment. Then after that structured opening, we sort of go to less structure. So we might invite people to ask questions of each other, having heard from the other people in 2 or 3 go-rounds. They might have a question that they'd like to ask to better understanding, questions of genuine interest, rhetorical questions. When that's part of the plan, we're sure to let people know even before the go-rounds start, maybe when we're sort of orienting people to the flow of the meeting. Let them know that they're going to have this opportunity to ask each other questions, because then they can listen in a way that helps them pay attention to what they're curious about and what they'd like to learn more about, rather than listening in the way most of us listen in most situations, where you're listening and you're kind of thinking, oh, well, what might I like to say? So just this act of previewing the opportunity to ask each other questions can shape how people listen. Often do a closing with a final go-round and try to use a question or two that will promote some reflection on the experience of the dialogue or promote connection. So examples might be, what did you do or not do that helped this conversation to be a dialogue? I love that as a reflective question. Another question I kind of like is there something that you especially appreciated, something that moved you or touched you? This is a way that participants can acknowledge the value of each other. Other evaluative questions, like what worked well for you, what didn't work well for you, we have people fill out a feedback form. So that's not something that we usually process in the group, particularly in, just an introductory dialogue. Okay, see, next slide. Now, the sort of session format that I just ran through works on small groups, but if you have a large group, you have to, of course, do some small group breakouts for that to work. You can't have a go-round with 75 people. So my suggestion about that is to have the full group together at the beginning, and people, whatever orientation they need to the flow of the meeting, have people make some proposals and so forth, and to go into small groups with ideally 6 or 8 people each with a facilitator. That can be hard to staff, but even if at the time of doing this, you ask the group to find a volunteer who will facilitate, better than nothing. So I really like to have facilitators identified ahead of time and give them a little bit of orientation to their role. And the end of those small group dialogues, which might be 45 minutes or an hour, I typically would bring people back into the full group and hear from whoever would like to share something from their dialogue experience. You've probably been a lot of small group breakout meetings where somebody's asked to be a reporter for the small group to take notes and then make some general comments. That's something that I would do in a dialogue because it's not a task-oriented meeting. It's not like a meeting where you're trying to generate a bunch of ideas or next steps or whatever, where you really want that list of things that come out of the small group. Rather, it's a personal kind of connection that happens in a dialogue. So I would therefore be very inclined to just bring the group together, just whoever would like to raise their hand and share something, they share something that they shared with their group, or share an insight or whatever. Because hearing something personal from a set of people is going to sort of fit with the flow and purpose of dialogue better than a general report that's kind of disembodied from the people involved. Okay, next slide here. To get back to communication agreements. Now, some people use the term ground rules, but that may suggest rules that are imposed on the group, and our commitment is to help people have the kind of conversations they want to have, one that's connecting and not divisive. It's their conversation. So we propose that they make communication agreements with each other. We found that it's best to start with a proposed set of agreements, because over time you get experience about what's helpful to have, and we've also found that the kind of things we propose usually are acceptable to folks. But give people a chance to look at those proposed agreements, ask questions, get clarification, make additions, make revisions, and etc. And when it seems like there's some consensus in the room, like the questions asked and suggestions made, would say something simple like, so is everyone willing to take these as your agreements with each other? That's usually the time we also say something about our role, that in our role we'll remind them if they forgot their agreements and help them stay focused on the purposes that they came to fulfill with each other. So some sample agreements. This is really just one whole set. At the end, Susan's going to point to a 25-page that I put together for Welcoming America that will give you some more ideas, and there's also a longer 108-page dialogue guide that gives more ideas about agreements. But this is just one set. So the first, work in a respectful manner, avoiding a critical tone, and will listen with resilience. It might seem like listening is a passive activity, but as I kind of suggested before, you can listen with different intentions. You can listen to a counter-argument or to critique or understand. So asking people to listen carefully and also with the understanding that there might be something that's hard to hear, but we're asking if people can agree to kind of hang in there and to not either withdraw or react in those moments. Times when people can ask each other questions, they can think about that time when they found something hard to hear, and they can ask, can you say something more about what you meant when you said that? Because when I heard such and such a word, it kind of triggered something in me. I want to know what that word means to you. Let's see an example of a question that doesn't shy away from a hot moment, but demonstrates some curiosity. We'll speak for ourselves and not expect anyone to represent or defend an entire group. That doesn't mean you can't speak from some group identity, like, as a Somali or as a Bosnian, I sometimes feel viewed in such and such a way. But it means that you don't speak for every other person in your group, every other Bosnian or every other long-term resident of a community, and that no other participant should be asked to explain or defend an entire group. A lot of non-Muslim dialogue in my work, and it's really important to not have dialogue include one single Muslim, say, who's being asked to explain to millions of Muslims that are out there. That just isn't fair or appropriate, and doesn't contribute to individuals being able to connect and understand each other, the people in the room. We'll share time and not interrupt others. Now, this is a group agreement that I have a hard time doing without as a facilitator. And luckily, I don't think I've ever had a group say we don't want that to be one of our agreements. And because dominating and interrupting are the most common ways I think conversation can feel not so safe and satisfying. If someone's not ready or willing to answer a question, we'll accept a pass or a pass for now. The idea here is that all participation is voluntary, and no one should be able to put anybody else on a hot seat. Consider, depending on the context, having some sort of, this isn't on the slide, but having some sort of agreement about confidentiality, not so much probably in your things, nothing can go out of the room, because one of the good things of dialogue is as people develop new understandings, they can do some sharing of that, but to make sure that if anyone in the group requests confidentiality, that it will be honored. Sometimes I even ask people to agree that however they do take their experience out of the room, to do so in the spirit of the dialogue of promoting understanding and connection. Okay. So, I mentioned that we typically start with some sort of structured opening questions in the early part of the session. So a good opening question typically invites very personal speaking about experiences, meanings, values. Jessie gave an example when she was presenting about, asking people about their life experience that shaped some of the views that they have. While to the personal, there are many reasons, but one is it's really hard to argue with somebody else's experience. And if what you're trying to do is in a sort of context where there's a lot of judgment and debate, it can be helpful to go to that level of experience. And the thing is that hearing people's stories, as probably all of you know, can be quite engaging, and it can promote empathy and understanding, which is, of course, at the heart of dialogue. Good questions encourage reflection. elicit fresh information that stimulates genuine interest and challenges very simple stereotypes. And a good question can be answered by all the participants in a manner that supports the purposes of the dialogue. For example, if you're bringing together refugees and non-refugees, you want to make sure to ask questions that are meaningful to both of those groups, not just one. Here are some sample questions. Can you do something in your current life that gives you a positive feeling of connection to your past? A sight, a sound, a smell, a treasured object. Please share what makes it meaningful for you. So that's a question that refugees are going to resonate with the idea of a connection to the past, and non-refugees. People, beings typically have something they can share about their connection to the past that helps others to get to know them and what's meaningful to them. Is there a story you can tell about your life experience that might help others understand what it means to you to be living in the U.S., what you most appreciate, and what you find hard? There again, you can kind of assume that people in the refugee community are maybe struggling more with transitions and getting accustomed to a different culture and all that, but it can be very helpful and rich for people who are refugees to hear that people who are long-term members in their community might also have some struggles and some ways that they appreciate living in the U.S. or in a particular community. Excuse me. Okay, so I mentioned earlier having go-rounds where you go in the room in order and people can pass if it's their turn, they're just not ready, and you can come back to them. There's also a format that's sometimes referred to as popcorn, where people pop when they're ready. In other words, the order is according to who's raising their hands and showing that they're ready. But in both cases, we want to make sure that people have paper and something to write with, so they can hear the question that's being asked, reflect on it, and jot down some notes for themselves. So we only start the go-round where people speak. Everybody's had a chance to think and write. This helps with, not giving pat answers, not going to the easiest place in that question, and to really think. A lot of people might have to think about that question about connection to the past and what's meaningful. It also helps people to approach the question in their own way, rather than responding or reacting to the earlier speakers. We've probably always all been situations where the first speaker has a big impact on how everybody else is responding, and people might actually use their speaking time to respond to the first speaker rather than speak to the question. So this also helps with that. And it also helps people to really listen if they already had time to prepare their own response. I know in many situations where if I'm the sixth person to speak, I have been listening very careful to person 1 through 5 if I'm still trying to figure out what I want to say. So this pause to think and write can be really helpful in supporting listening. So I mentioned earlier, you can move from such a very structured way of invite speaking to people asking questions and inviting people to notice some themes, say something about what was moving, surprising, and then more open discussion. But we definitely go from tight to loose in our meeting design. So the role of the facilitator. Well, one of it is creating a safe enough, welcoming environment. And this even means something as simple as greeting people at the door. I know I've unfortunately had situations where if I'm facilitating, I'm running around doing all the last-minute minute stuff of or getting friends together or something like that, and I try to avoid that so that the very moment somebody shows up, I can greet them, and if I don't know them already, introduce myself. A key part of the goal is to have people stay on task and on time, and say in relation to what Mavish spoke about, to stay on purpose, to stay in a sort of dialogic game. And it'll also be up to the facilitator if it seems like maybe the plan that was made, the agenda that was put out is not quite working out, to see if a revision is in order. It might be as simple as saying, well, given that we only have another 20 minutes, we're going to just address one of the two questions here, something like that. You can check with the group to see what their input is if you have to make a change, and make sure that you're not mind reading. So, for example, if you could think like, so we were planning to address A and then B tonight, but I'm spending a fair amount of energy around A. So you could just spend a few minutes on A and move to B, or we could spend them on A and B in a follow-up meeting or whatever. But to put it out to the group if you're sensing a crunch, and people's thoughts. But you just make sure that it's not just the vocal people who are swaying you, without from the quieter people. So if I'm sensing that a number of people are saying, oh yeah, let's give more time to A, I'm saying, is there anyone who would like to speak to B before moving on? So it's not just the sort of voices. A big piece is guarding against domination and welcoming all the voices. Reminding participants about agreements as necessary. And the facilitation role is not about being a content expert, being the center of attention, influencing the content, or participating in the content. Excuse me. One key piece of advice that I'd offer about intervening is to try to avoid intervening in a way that leaves people feel shamed. Because if people are anxious, the last thing you want is for them to feel humiliated in some way. So, some examples. So if an agreement is broken, like if somebody interrupts a person, you can refer back explicitly to the agreement. Like, I just want to remind you about the agreement, not interrupting. But unless that's a real concern for John, or unless you want to reflect to that agreement because there's been a pattern in the group, you can usually do something much simpler, like, excuse me, I don't think Mary was finished speaking. Were you finished speaking, Mary? Very, very simple, not shaming. If you have a concern about tone and pace in relation to agreements about respectful speaking and careful listening, you can just share that concern with the group. Like, noticing that the pace and intensity of the conversation is picked up here, and that would be fine, but I just want to check in. How one for you in terms of the agreements that you made? When it picks up, it can get harder to listen carefully and to speak with care. Just something like that, and then you can get some input from the group. It just reminds them of agreements and their intentions without making a judgment about it. Just giving some gentle advice to be aware of it. And pace is really important in dialogue, because a slow pace encourages reflection, and a fast pace tends to support reactivity. Another example, suppose somebody speaks in a very disrespectful manner. You could say something like, it sounds like you've got a lot of passion about this issue, and the way you just expressed it probably didn't feel so good to some of the other people in the room. So could you try and say, what's at the heart of your passion and your concern? And speak about that in a way that might be easier for other people to hear. So you can even be empathic and concerned when somebody is really stepping out of the spirit of dialogue to welcome the passion, welcome the emotional aspect, while also attending to the needs of people who might be checking out if the particular style of speaking were to continue. And finally, if someone speaks at length in a very emotional way, and this sometimes happens, and it's really tough as a facilitator to, try to tend to sharing airtime, it can be really easy to let emotion take you off of attending to the whole group. And so one little guideline I would say is just, there are going to always be times that you want to be a little flexible and, not cut somebody off you start letting somebody go on for 5 or 6 or 7 minutes because emotional, then you're not really taking care of the whole group. Sometimes one person can kind of hijack the agenda due to emotion. So you can again find ways to empathic and acknowledge the emotion. Don't let it become let one person be the center of attention for a long time. And speaking about time management, one of the hardest parts of facilitating, I think. So here are some guidelines. One is to be realistic about time when you're planning a session. Still, after all these years, plan too much. So don't think that you can show a 90-minute movie and a very in-depth dialogue after it with, multiple rounds, breakouts, and all that. If you're using what I call a stimulus to start, like a film or a panel, you'll keep the dialogue agenda modest in terms of time. Especially, again, if you're working with just an evening, a 7 o'clock to 9 o'clock kind of frame. So, for example, after showing a film, you could just have people talk in pairs after the film about what touched them or moved them or what questions they're sitting with, what insights they had, so forth. And then you could facilitate a large group discussion where people can raise their hands and share something. But that going to pairs kind of allows people to reflect a little bit about their feeling and their thoughts before speaking in the large group. Clarity about expectations and limits is important. Please take up to 2 minutes to respond to this question. Sometimes toward the end, if there's a parting go-around and I see that we're supposed to wrap up in 10 minutes, I actually kind of enlist group in attending to time a bit with me and just say, okay, so now we just have about 10 minutes till we're supposed to end. So to do this go-around, I'm going to ask you to really just say a few sentences so that everybody gets a chance to speak. If it's not the sort of thing where you want to say, about 75 seconds would work. Model brevity. Sometimes there's a time in a session where it does make sense for the facilitator to speak something that's not content-oriented, a simple introduction or a simple parting comment or whatever. And you can model if you're saying, just name and where you live, and you think, it makes sense for me to say that too. You can say, I'm Maggie Herzig and I live in Lexington. Then going on and on. Oh, I live in that part of Lexington, down by the old pond. So you model the brevity that you're hoping for from others. Use 3x5 cards. I do this a lot. So, for example, at the end of a dialogue, particularly if you've got a large group and you really want to be able to hear from everybody at the end, maybe say you've got 20 people in the room and you want to make sure that everybody gets to have some last word. I might say, So what are you taking with you from this dialogue, and is there a next step you'd like to see happen? It's out 2 different colors of 3x5 cards. Please write on the yellow card what you're taking with you, a question, insight, or whatever. And on the blue card, any ideas you have about next steps. And after you've written on those cards, please write. Leslie will give you a chance to read what you wrote on your card. And if it's okay, you will also collect those cards so that the planning team can remember what you're taking with you and your ideas about next steps. I find that to be very, very useful, and it helps people to stay focused. And if they read the card and then start elaborating at length, say, it's best if everybody just reads their card, because otherwise we just won't have time to hear from everybody. Finally, co-facilitation has an awful lot of benefits. One of them is that you can take turns tracking time. It's difficult when I'm doing a solo facilitation to pay attention to time at the same as paying attention to everything else. So, as Mavish said, it can be useful to have co-facilitation teams that represent some of the diversity in the group. And finally, debriefing. I mentioned that we typically have evaluation forms at the end of a dialogue where people can write something about what worked and what didn't work so well. But in addition, if you worked with a planning team or co-facilitator or both, you can meet afterwards. That's the idea, to meet afterwards and talk about what went well, what didn't, what you do differently next time, what liked or didn't like about the way you played your own role, what did you most admire about other people's contributions to the team, and you address possible next steps that could get kind of left as loose ends if the group didn't come together again. So those steps might even be as simple as write a thank you note to people who contributed or donated space, or sending promised materials, or responding to ideas that people had about next steps. So you can make sure that there's a close or a planning process for a next meeting if people have asked for a next meeting. So with that, I'll turn it back to Susan.
Great. Thanks so much, Maggie, and to all of our speakers. So this is the time when you get to respond as the audience. Please send us your questions in the Q&A box. You can also feel free to use the chat feature as well. And we're getting some questions already, so I want to get us going. And the first set of questions kind of have to do with logistics. So I don't know, Maggie, you might want to take the first crack answering these, and then I would also invite the other panelists to share more on logistics. So question around duration, how long should you plan for a dialogue? How many hours is a typical dialogue? And how often? Is this something that's a one-time event? Is it something that you're should be thinking about hosting monthly or quarterly? And then finally, related to logistics, what about using interpreters, especially for people who may not be fully fluent in English? How do you weave interpreters, language interpretation, into this process? So again, a question around duration of the session, how often, the frequency, and the use of interpreters.
Well, it's a great question. I find in terms of evening times, which is often what people can give you, I hate to go with less than 2.5 hours, like 7 to 9:30, just because if you want to have a careful opening and orientation and really hear from people and have a proper closing, it can be hard to do with a lot less. And as for having multiple sessions, it's great. And I think Mavish mentioned, it's important to, in some cases, to have a sustained kind of dialogue, like meeting monthly. The one I would advise on that is, like if I'm doing something like an Arab-Jewish dialogue, I would never offer an Arab-Jewish dialogue for less than a series of 4 sessions, just because I find that just building the trust and getting people to know each other a little takes a first session, and then there's there's more to do. So I find it useful to invite people, if I'm thinking that it's a multi-session sort of thing, to invite people, ask them to make a commitment to 3 sessions or 4 sessions, or that they can renew if they want to meet more times. But one of the advantages of that is sometimes if you have an ongoing dialogue, that's monthly dialogue, maybe after 5 or 6 sessions, a number of people have felt that kind of got what they came for. And you can just notice attrition. Some people aren't showing up, and leaves a kind of bad taste. Well, gee, did I say something wrong last time? And so if you have a session of 4, a series of 4 or a series of 5, then people can talk about, do they want to have more meetings? Do they want to do something different? Do they want to do an action project together? And then you don't get this sort of explained action. That's what I'd say about that. The others have thoughts as well.
Yeah, does anyone want to talk about using interpreters?
Yeah, Betsy. When Welcoming America, when we did dialogue training in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, as part of our trainings, we asked the potential facilitators to engage in a dialogue, and so at that dialogue, we had 4 people who spoke through an interpreter, and I would say, as long as all the best practices around interpretation are followed, like interpreting exactly what people say, then it actually worked out really well. I mean, everyone was patient with the process, and it was, though very, very emotional and hard to hear things were said through the interpreter, it was still people were able to hang with it and really hear from each other. So the time that I've seen interpretation happen, it actually worked just as without.
Great. Let's into some other questions. We're getting a number. The next question is about how to encourage invitees to participate, people who might be resistant or even hostile to your process or to your work. How do you get those kinds of people to even show up for dialogue and to take it seriously?
I can start with that one.
Great.
And see if others have ideas. I guess the question that you perhaps want to ask yourself is that the person you want in a dialogue? If what you're hoping for, what you're hoping for is sort of a mutual understanding and connection, is the best participant someone who's very opposed to your point of view or the work you're doing? They may or may not be. So I think that's an important thing to think about. And it might not be for that person dialogue that's bringing together people from across a spectrum of opinion, values, might not feel like the safest place for them either.
So is it that you tend to be reaching out more to people who are kind of unsure about their opinion in something like this, who may not be as openly hostile? Is that it's a matter of sort of figuring out who your key target audience is and who you actually might be able to influence in this kind of dialogue? And
I wouldn't use the word influence, but what you're hoping for is, who's interested in it, who's unsure, certainly. One way to think of it is, we hope sometimes a constructive conversation might not be between someone who's a 1 and a 9 on a spectrum of 0 to 10, but a constructive conversation might be between, folks who are closer to like a 3 and a 7. I hate to use a numerical example on that, but that might be one way to think about it. And then going back to the purpose. Is your purpose trying to change someone's mind? Well, then that perhaps is not the best process to be using if what we're trying to do is influence someone or advocate for something. So really think back to what's the purpose, and then also who are the ideal participants, so the sort of the piece, the purpose, the participants, and the process, and what's the ideal mix of the three.
This is Jessie, and I'd like to just add to that. And again, we at Welcoming America may have some different purposes than Public Conversations Project, but because we are trying to bring people into the room who may have a hostile perspective or who are resistant to have some immigrants and immigration. We are always trying to find ways to get them into the room. And the two ways that we've done that is to go where people already are, and so to go to a place where people are meeting anyway for a reason, and to have the dialogue there. And so we've done several dialogues in classes, at university classes, within the classroom. So the group of people who are in that class are going to show up to that class anyway. They have diversity of opinions if you go to particular schools, and then you can have the conversation with everyone who shows up, and then it can be done in different places. And the other way to get people in the room is through relationships. And if we think about it, we all know people who are hostile to immigration, whether it's a neighbor or a father-in-law or a friend or somebody's friend's husband, and just inviting them because of the relationship. They come into the door because they know the person, and then that's a way to get people into the room who might not otherwise attend an immigration event.
Great, thanks. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about something Avish brought up, emotional anxiety, which is something that I think many of us like to avoid. And I think that the idea of running dialogue sometimes makes people feel anxious. So can you talk a little bit about an example of how you've seen emotion rise up in some way during a dialogue, and how you responded to that, and maybe talk a little bit about how to prepare. Mashi talked a little bit about preparing yourself for emotional anxiety, or to kind of help, prevent that as a facilitator or a planner. So let's talk a little bit about anxiety.
Sure, and I think it does start with preparing yourself as well. I think a big step is just acknowledging that this could be emotional experience, and just sort of being mentally prepared for what might be possible for yourself as a facilitator when you are engaged in sort of some of the pre-work and the prep conversations with possible participants, trying to understand what might be possible triggers or hot button issues for them. So again, so being aware of what might come up and acknowledging that in itself preparation. If you're going to use a film and watch a movie together, then have a dialogue and discussion, it's useful for a lot of different reasons for you to obviously view that movie yourself, but also view it with this filter of what are sort of emotional triggers in that movie for yourself. So you are preparing yourself in that way. And then no matter how well each of us are prepared, we're obviously human beings, and there might be a participant who says something or triggers you in a certain way, we can probably each think of conversations where we've had where someone's said something, and regardless of whatever mode you've gone into as a facilitator, it just blew away. And if you can, to try it, to think about something this person has said, something about them that you can appreciate, so that you can focus on the positive and move on, move yourself through that triggering process. That could be one. I'm not a I'm not a therapist, so I'm not an expert in that area, but there's certainly specific tools mentioned in both the guides that Maggie mentioned in terms of emotionally preparing yourself for these conversations. But
so can one of you give an example of someone who participated in a dialogue who said something that incited emotion, and then how it was responded to? Can you think of a concrete example?
I think of an example when I facilitated a dialogue at Georgia State, and one of the participants, very angry and also hurt tone of voice, talked about a time when she didn't have food for her and her daughter, and she was denied food stamps, and she called them the illegals next door, got the food stamps, and she felt like the government was more interested in feeding them than in feeding Americans. And even this is the point why we have that, because I did find myself personally triggered by the anger, and also kind of wondering, by the anger in the conversation. I think it was actually a really wonderful thing for her to say, because it helped us have a very deep and meaningful conversation, but I did get personally triggered. And I think the thing about dialogues, about being a facilitator in a dialogue, is that you really shouldn't say too much. And so I like my role is to help this conversation happen, and to help the group have the conversation that they need to have. And really, if we're doing what we need to do, the conversation will take a life of its own and really just begin to grow and to develop. And so, because I'm not asked, at the presentation, I'm not asked, I try to kind of go a little bit into the background and let the conversation happen. It'll give the facilitator some space for when they are triggered to just breathe through that and kind of get on the other side of the emotion, remind yourself that this is a good thing that it's happening, this is why we're here. And by the time it passes, you'll be ready to help the conversation.
Great. Let's back up a little bit and talk about folks who may be looking at doing this for the very first time. I think one of our folks said, they're really starting at ground zero. So can you give examples of, how you start at ground zero, really, at the pilot project planning stage? Any experiences you might be able to share wisdom for people who are starting out on this for the very, very first time?
I'll speak to that. This is Maggie. One possibility is to if you've got a planning group and you've got some ideas for structuring a dialogue, and the more structure, the better. If the less confident you feel about a more open kind of conversation, the more structure can comfort you and help people stay on track. But let's suppose you do have a planning group of 4 or 5 people, and you're intending to do something that involves people. Your little pilot, you and your planning group can put together a sort of draft session and then run elves through it, and take turn. Whoever's going to be in the facilitating role can play the facilitating role in the pilot, in the sort of run through. Or you'd even, you don't have a planning group that would go through a sort of pilot with you. So you have a couple of friends who would bring some diversity of experience. Ask them, would you mind doing this pilot dialogue just to help me try out some questions and give me some ideas about good questions to ask. So, get help and use structure. I guess that's... And also, see if there's some mentors around. If they're sort of people who are seen as having good leadership skills, or people who are in the helping professions like social workers or whatever, if you've got a connection to somebody like that, ask them for some mentoring or even to do some co-facilitation, even if they're not maybe signed on to do a lot, but just to help you get launched through co-facilitating with you.
Great, thanks, Maggie. So here's a question about the workplace. Has this model been used in the workplace? And I'm sure many, if not most, of the people on the call work in very, very diverse workplaces. Think about the use of dialogue in the workplace to kind of build understanding between employees.
I can stay with that, and maybe others will have ideas too. It certainly can be used, but it's important to recognize that there are kind of two realities in a workplace. There's the sort of collaborative, especially in a small organization, there might be kind of a family feeling, everybody's, at least on the surface, kind of getting along and so forth. And then there's this other reality, which is some people have power over other people. Some people can inspire other people. So you just want to make sure that whatever level of vulnerability might be involved in having conversations is one that kind of fits with the realities of a employment situation.
Any other thoughts from our speakers on that before we move on? And again, if you have questions or comments, we'd invite you to send those in via the Q&A feature or the chat. Either one is fine. We have a follow-up question around using language interpretation and the efficiency of doing that. Do you have any thoughts about the process of language interpretation? I mean, my experience is that certainly it can slow down the process sometimes. Any other lessons learned around using interpreters in dialogue for folks who might not be fluent in English?
Jesse, and I've only used the interpreter one time, but it did feel, so of course the process was down in terms of, it took, to say something and then have it interpreted, but it never felt like, I think as a facilitator, you just build the time for that, and because we always also do the 2.5 hours to make sure there's plenty of time for a real conversation, and so I think it just probably will require some more planning, to really time it out and think about, well, how many people are going to need interpretation, and where's that person going to sit, and how is the room going to be structured so everyone can still sit in a circle. And how we had it was that everyone was sitting in a circle and the interpreter just sat just behind the participants who need the interpreter. And everyone needed the interpreter to understand each other. I really didn't feel that it slowed, that it made it feel like it was dragging on or anything like that. I think in general, the conversation pace, as we alluded to before, is that it's in general kind of a slow and reflective pace, and I think the interpretation only adds to that.
Ms. Marvish, the other thing that I might add to that is an opportunity to work with the interpreter or the interpreters beforehand so that they have a sense of what the process is going to be, and feel, and so if they have any questions about the actual dialogue process, to make sure that there's some time spent with them prior to the dialogue itself would be a really important tool.
Great speakers. Oh, I'm sorry, Maggie. Did you have something?
Oh, I was just going to say this is not so much an answer directly to if you need a fair amount of interpretation, but if working with a group where English is a second language and some people are quite fluent and some people kind of struggle along a little bit more, that speaks to the importance, I think, of if you're going to put out, say, questions for a go around, to have them in writing, have them posted or a handout, and then build in even more pause time to think about the question. So if somebody's struggling with a word, if interpreters aren't there, but somebody's kind of struggling with a word or something like that, they can really take the time to make sure that they understand the question. Helpful.
Well, thank you, speakers. That was great, and I'm just going to wrap up now because I know our time is running out for today's webinar. But we hope that you will stay engaged, that your appetite has just been whetted today, and so you'll want to stay engaged with us on dialogue. I wanted to just point out a couple of tools that we had available, and Maggie mentioned one of them, the Dialogue Toolkit, which is the picture on the right of the screen. That's available at welcomingamerica.org, and it's a great way to get started in planning your own dialogue and getting some additional tips. We also have a section on dialogue in the Receiving Communities Toolkit, which is also at welcomingamerica.org, and some of the lessons learned, many of which you've heard about today, but how people have used dialogue to build greater understanding and some of the lessons from the field around that. There are some additional dialogue resources that I wanted to share with you. It just so happens that Cities of Migration is having a dialogue webinar later this week, and they're going to be featuring some interesting work from New Zealand and Canada, bringing dialogue to bring together new immigrant and indigenous communities. So it's a little late at night at 7 p.m. To deal with the different time zones, but I think that's another great resource and some interesting examples that could provide some inspiration. So those are registration for that webinar is open, and you can go to you can Google City of Migration and find out more about that particular webinar. There's also a new toolkit that's out from the New York Humanities Council, Community Conversations for Adults and Young Adults, and they have a tool specifically on immigration. So again, I would encourage you to look at the New York Humanities Council's conversation. I had an opportunity to participate in one of their conversations a couple of months ago, and it's really a fun, engaging opportunity, and I think tools that could be easily adapted to many of your own communities. And here's some contact information from today's presenters. So if you have other questions or comments or just want to get in touch with them, I'm sure that they would be happy to hear from you. And I'm here in case any of you are writing these badly, but we will also be sending out today's webinar slides after the webinar, so you'll be able to access this information later as well. And then, again, for those of you who want to dig a little bit deeper on dialogues and continue this conversation, we are launching a learning circle focused on dialogues, and we'd love to have you join us. Learning circles are an opportunity for you to connect with your peers, so others who are interested in learning more and doing more around dialogue. It's also an opportunity to connect with experts like those we heard from today. Our learning circles convene quarterly, and they're typically either a conference call or webinar format. We have learning circles already underway around communications, as well as a second learning circle focused on comprehensive community planning approaches. So we would love to have you join our next learning circle on dialogue. If you're interested in joining, the application process is pretty simple. You just need to email Hannah and let her know the following information. Give us a sense of the geographic scope in which you work. Tell us why you would like to join a learning circle focused on dialogue, and then tell us a little bit more about what parts of dialogue interest you the most, what you might most like to learn about or share. And then Hannah can get back to you and let you know about the next steps. The deadline for joining the Learning Circle for emailing Hannah is July 10th. So please, if you're interested, let us know, and we can get that circle formed quickly. That wraps up our session today, 5 minutes early. That might be a record. I want to thank all of you for joining us on the Dialogue webinar. I want to thank all of our wonderful speakers, Jesse, Madish, and Maggie, for joining us. I want to thank Mita and the team at the Office of Refugee Resettlement for their support. And most of all, I want to thank all of you for the tremendous work that you're doing in your communities to build greater community support for refugees and greater understanding. So with that, we will sign off, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your week. Thank you so much. Goodbye.